I'm here with my professor, Sequoia Miller. He's a curator, a historian, a studio potter, and also a professor at U of T. So my first question is, you are now like your main um, job is being a curator, but you were once a full-time studio potter. How does that influence your role as an academic and as a curator?
Yeah, for sure. I think it influences my role a lot, both as a curator and as an academic scholar, professor. I think more than anything, it influences the way that I see and the way that I understand or read maybe ceramics. Because when I look at a ceramic object in particular, I'm thinking about how it came into being. And I am thinking from an experiential vantage point of like what it would mean to bring that object into the world, which is a pretty different sort of layer of meaning onto the object than most people would bring in. I think for most people, when they see an object, they sort of take it for what it is. They kind of see it as a thing. But when you can imagine making it or have experienced something similar to making it, it sort of inflects the way you work or the way you perceive, I guess. I think the other point is that I think that for a lot of people who are art historians and really anyone who's consuming artwork in whatever format, there's a way to just sort of accept that these objects have come into being or sort of are in the world. And I think that as a person who for a long time was dedicated to making objects, creating objects, I have a greater sympathy maybe for the challenges that are inherent to bringing something into the world that hasn't existed before. There's a kind of core generative act that it's always easier to sort of evaluate or criticize or try to make sense of something that exists rather than to bring something unfamiliar into the world.
Oh, that's amazing. So also you have stated how even though conservation is so important, visitors sometimes like miss out on certain experiences related to ceramics, like for example, touching the material or using it. Can you like expand on this idea?
Sure, I think that however one encounters an object or an experience, you are only experiencing it from in so many ways or in a kind of limited number of possibilities. So for example, in a museum, you miss out on the tactile. Typically, you miss out on the tactile encounter. When you're in, say, a store or an auction house, you might miss out on some of the historical context, or you might miss out on some of the duration of the relationship with an object that you live with or that you repeatedly visit in a museum. So I don't think that we can have every experience with every object all the time. Like everything's necessarily bracketed. That said, I think with encountering ceramics in museums, one of the great capacities we have as humans is to infer the sense of touch through the sense of sight. So when I feel that when we look at an object in a museum, or even when we look at an object in the world, we almost inevitably imagine touching it or holding it. We think about what the weight of it would feel like, or the surface, or how many arms we would need to hold it. There's this kind of implicit, almost subconscious imagining that we do about the physical presence of the object. So I feel like even in museums, even though we can't often touch the objects, we can sort of infer what their physical presence is.
Nice. So, in creating an exhibition, I'm sure there is an exchange between the curator and the artist. Um, for example, in the Boyle exhibition, it's great, by the way. We went there for class. It's so creepy, but like in like a very interesting way. Um, what parts of the design or presentation are products of the artist's wishes, or practicality, or your recommendations?
Yeah, I think every project is different, but when you're working with a living artist, there's absolutely a contribution and a collaborative aspect to the presentation of the work. In terms of the Sherry Boyle exhibition in particular, that project was really conceived as an installation, as a single entity. Sherry is also a kind of a visionary artist, and so she really can imagine the world of her work. So not just the work itself, but the entire kind of world or universe that it occupies. Because of those two aspects, Sherry had a very strong voice in the design of the exhibition, in the layout, in the sort of the stage or the set that we built. So more so than would be the case with many projects, the artist had quite a lot of input into the installation and the image. I would say that they're like every part of the exhibition in terms of the arrangement of the works has a collaborative aspect in it. So, for example, Sherry Boyle was very interested in having paintings on either side of the kind of four-armed statue, Judy, but kind of the orientation of the paintings, their proximity to each other, scale of the wall painting behind Judy were all came out of conversations between the two of us. So I would say that there's sort of a collaborative thread running through the installation, but in this case, it's really the vision of Sherry Boyle. And our role, I feel, at the Gardiner was to help facilitate that vision, both in terms of helping to kind of distill or clarify it, and then helping to bring it into being.
And what would be the difference if, say, the artist was not alive and you had like more control over the exhibition?
Well, some people find it much easier to work with artists who are no longer alive. They tend to like have fewer opinions of.
Yeah.
So sometimes it can be your specialty. Like if you're a historian who works, with earlier material, you have a lot fewer sort of stakeholders, fewer people to be accountable to. It's the case, though, even that with contemporary exhibitions, just depending on the project, that the artist may or may not have a strong hand or be involved with the actual installation. So for example, we're finishing the installation of a smaller lobby exhibition by an American artist named Sharif Bey. So the lobby has about 8 works in it, 9 works actually. And Sharif and I worked together to think about which objects would cohere as a representation of his work, a sort of a moment in time and a kind of communication of his perspective and sets of questions. So we determined a checklist together where I fortunately was able to pick the works that I felt were strongest for me, but also very much wanted the artist to feel confident and comfortable about selections that I was making. In this case, with Sharif Bey, he has not had input into the actual installation. I described to him what my plans would be in terms of where we would put the works and how they would relate to each other, but it's really been more up to us in terms of the actual realization of the presentation as a whole.
Oh, that's amazing. So also, oh, sorry. So focusing more on the Sherry Boyle exhibition, there are a lot of animatronics there. When we were there for the class, I think the first time the white elephant turned its head, we all screamed.
Yeah.
So it certainly adds to the uncanny valley of the exhibition. But I wanted to ask if this would qualify, in your opinion, as performance art, even though there are like no living people involved.
It's an interesting question. I mean, there is absolutely a performative aspect to this project and to Sherry's work as a whole. You may recall that Sherry has been a performer and continues to perform periodically. She actually commissioned a small film to be made in the exhibition with dancers who were in costume. So on a very kind of forward-leaning level, the whole metaphor of the exhibition is theatrical and performative. There's a giant stage in the middle of the show, so it's clear that performance is part of the language. To my way of thinking, I would not describe it as performance art per se. I feel like performance art has a different trajectory and set of parameters. I think one thing that makes the project and Sherry Boyle's work so engaging and complex is that it doesn't conform to any one category. So she's drawing from histories of performance as well as histories of ceramics and other kind of forms of visual representation, but not connecting through to like one particular background or trajectory of performance art. So I would contrast that, for example, with the piece that we presented at the Gardiner by the artist Castles in early 2020. And this was a work called Up to and Including Their Limits. And this work was very explicitly like a performance artwork that then had a sculptural remnant that was presented for the remainder of the exhibition. And in that work, Castles was very clearly referencing the histories of performance and performance art in particular. So there are ways that artists can really mine one particular vein of kind of history or of earlier work. And then there are other times when artists can work across those histories, and both can be compelling.
Okay, great. So ceramics is something that is almost universal across cultures, and this is highlighted by Sherry Boyle's piece called "The Potter." Why do you think this universality with ceramics exists?
Why do I think it exists?
Yeah.
Well, because it's so useful, actually. Like clay is really useful. It's like one of the earliest technologies that was developed, and it's also something, of course, that endures, right? It's fragile in many regards, but it doesn't melt away particularly. Clay is found almost throughout the planet. There are some places where it doesn't exist, of course, or where it's frozen forever, so it's really hard to get to. But by and large, where people live, there's almost always clay. And the earth is actually generating more clay out of rock, out of the mantle of the earth, than, than humans can possibly use. So it's a constantly renewing resource as well. There's energy consumption for sure in the firing and making ceramic, making permanent of clay. But it's ubiquitous in the earth, and it's so intimately tied to development of humanity, civilization, human consciousness. Um, yeah, that's why I think it's universal.
Great. So this is my last question, by the way. So in past generations, the artist took pride in being the sole creator of a piece, but now artists take a more collaborative approach. For example, Sherry Boyle worked with other artists to create the animatronics and also the acrylic nails in the peacock spider. Why do you think this like shift from like the lonely artist to like this collaborative approach has occurred?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think that this idea of the lonely artist, as you say, is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. And if we look back further and more broadly, what we find is more typical throughout human experience is the collective act of making. That could either be a workshop model, a village or a town model, or a family model. So this idea of the artist as a sole creative, force is an invention of modernity, right? It's an invention only of the last few hundred years, which if we think about sort of the scope and intensity of human making, it's really just a tiny blip. So in a way, Sherry, as a number of other artists are doing, are really going back to a model of shared creative practice. And I think ceramics in particular is a great example of a kind of collective creative practice where authorship is distributed from the individual to the group. So an example of that would be certain types of ceramic, say dingware from China, is like a particular type of ceramic that's not associated with an individual or kind of heroic creative genius, but rather is emerging out of a particular place, a certain geography that has certain very specific materials associated with it, a time, and a culture that it meets the needs of that culture. So I see Sherry Boyle's collaborations as being very much within the tradition of sort of this broader conception of human creativity.
Oh, great, great, amazing. Well, so thank you so much for your time.